Hey guys, tonight we wander away from the marble temples, military triumphs, and polished statues of ancient Rome. Because beneath all that glory existed another Rome entirely. A Rome hidden in crowded alleyways and smoke-filled taverns. A Rome of exhaustion, survival, cheap wine, aching feet, and people trying to endure another day inside the largest city on earth. Tonight, we follow the daily life of a Roman harlot living near the Aventine district, close to the river docks where sailors, merchants, gamblers, laborers, and drunks flood the taverns long after sunset. Not a noblewoman wrapped in silk. Not the wife of a senator. Just an ordinary woman surviving one exhausting day at a time beneath the weight of the empire. So before you settle in tonight, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into forgotten history. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating seeing people from across the globe gathering together for these nighttime walks through the past. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or AC for that soft background hum, and let's slowly wander into the crowded streets of ancient Rome. You wake before sunrise to the sound of somebody arguing outside your window. Not a serious argument. Just the normal Roman kind. One voice is accusing somebody of stealing cabbages while another swears loudly upon the honor of Jupiter that the cabbages were already stolen when he bought them. Somewhere below, a mule complains to the heavens with a noise so miserable it almost sounds human. The city is awake already. Which unfortunately means you have to be awake too. Your room is small, damp, and permanently smells faintly of smoke. The apartment building leans slightly toward the alley outside in a way that inspires very little confidence. Cracks spread through the plaster walls while dark stains crawl across the ceiling from rainwater leaking through the roof during storms. The mattress beneath you is little more than a cloth sack stuffed with old straw. It crunches loudly whenever you move, and something inside occasionally scratches at night. You stopped investigating months ago. Ancient Rome teaches people very quickly how to ignore problems they cannot afford to solve. Weak gray light slips through the cloth hanging over your window opening. Outside, the alley below already swarms with movement. Laborers carrying tools. Women hauling water buckets. Vendors dragging wooden carts through muddy streets while shouting about bread, olives, onions, and fish. Always fish. Rome smells strongest in the morning. Fresh bread drifting from nearby ovens. Smoke rising from kitchens. Open drains baking beneath yesterday's heat. Wine spilled into tavern floors. Animals. Human sweat. The Tiber River nearby carrying every unpleasant smell imaginable directly through the city like a personal insult from nature itself. You sit up slowly while your back protests immediately. Yesterday's work still lingers in your shoulders and hips. One elbow pops loudly enough to concern you slightly. Probably nothing serious. Hopefully. You splash cold water onto your face from the ceramic basin beside your bed. The water smells faintly metallic, but at least it looks cleaner than the public fountain near the fish market. That alone feels luxurious. You pull on your faded tunic and tie the loose belt around your waist. The fabric carries traces of cheap perfume and smoke. Mostly smoke. Near the doorway hangs a polished bronze mirror small enough to remind you how expensive vanity truly is in Rome. Your reflection looks exhausted already. Your hair refuses cooperation. Your eyes still carry shadows from poor sleep. And somewhere near your jawline sits a bruise from a drunken customer who believed enthusiasm counted as charm. You touch it gently. Still sore. Across the hallway, another door slams open hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling beams. Livia steps into the corridor carrying a chamber pot with the expression of somebody deeply disappointed by humanity. She glances toward you. You alive? Barely. Good enough. Fair conversation. She disappears downstairs muttering violent things about sailors while you finish tying your hair back with a strip of faded cloth. From below comes the growing noise of the tavern already filling with customers. Cups slam against tables. Men laugh too loudly. Somebody begins singing horribly off-key before sunrise. Rome truly rewards confidence over talent. You descend the staircase carefully while the old wood creaks beneath every step. The building sounds constantly on the verge of collapse, yet somehow remains standing through stubbornness alone. The tavern air hits immediately. Wine. Smoke. Sweat. Cooked onions. Wet wool. Fish oil. The scent settles into your skin so deeply now that even your blankets smell faintly drunk. Near the entrance, morning sunlight stretches across uneven floorboards while customers crowd around rough wooden tables. Sailors from the river docks occupy one corner already arguing over dice. A laborer sleeps with his head against the wall beside an empty wine cup. Two merchants debate grain prices with the seriousness of philosophers discussing the meaning of life. The tavern owner stands behind the counter counting coins while wearing the permanently irritated expression of a man who trusted people once and regretted it immediately. He looks up briefly. "You're late." You glance toward the doorway where dawn has barely touched the rooftops. "No, I'm not." He thinks about it. Still feels correct somehow. Close enough to affection. You begin collecting empty cups from the previous night while carefully navigating between chairs, boots, and one sleeping sailor stretched across half the floor like a fallen statue. A customer near the back table whistles when he sees you. You ignore it. Another snaps his fingers impatiently. You ignore that too. Roman men often mistake volume for importance. Near the kitchen doorway, Kasia leans against the wall drinking watered wine from a clay cup. Her dark hair is tied carefully with gold thread while perfume surrounds her like expensive smoke. Unlike most people here, Kasia still manages to look composed before noon. Honestly impressive. "You look terrible," she says. You grab a piece of bread from a tray beside her. "So do you." She smiles. "True." You eat quickly while the tavern swells louder around you. The bread is still warm from the ovens nearby, and for a brief moment the entire world feels softer. Warm bread has that effect. Outside, Rome continues roaring awake. Wagon wheels rattle violently across stone roads. Temple bells echo faintly above the district. Street vendors shout prices from crowded corners. Children race barefoot through puddles while exhausted mothers threaten them with sandals. A donkey somewhere nearby screams loud enough to frighten several birds from a rooftop. The empire sounds alive from every direction at once. A young soldier enters through the tavern doorway carrying his helmet beneath one arm. His armor still shines brightly, which means he probably hasn't served long enough to become miserable yet. Fresh recruit. Dangerously confident. He notices you immediately. Of course he does. Roman soldiers often walk into taverns believing every woman secretly dreams about military stories. He approaches with the posture of somebody trying very hard to appear heroic. "You from Rome?" he asks. You nod once. "Unfortunately." That catches him off guard slightly. "I've traveled," he announces proudly. "Then why come back?" Kasia nearly chokes on her wine beside you. The soldier stares for a moment before laughing awkwardly, unsure whether you've insulted him or flirted with him. Honestly, neither are impossible. He orders wine anyway and quickly joins a nearby table where he begins loudly describing military training to anybody trapped close enough to listen. You continue moving through the tavern carrying cups, wiping tables, and avoiding wandering hands with the speed and precision of somebody who has practiced this daily for years. Near the doorway, two gamblers argue violently over dice results. One swears by Mars himself that the other cheated. The accused responds by throwing an olive. Diplomacy collapses immediately afterward. The tavern owner storms toward them carrying a wooden spoon like a battlefield commander charging into war. Fight outside. Nobody moves. Several customers actually look disappointed the argument ended too quickly. You hide your smile while carrying empty dishes toward the back kitchen. The cook inside is already sweating through his tunic while shouting in Greek at a pot of burning onions. Smoke curls toward the ceiling. The smell somehow grows worse. Morning, you tell him. I hate everyone, he replies instantly. Fair enough. You step briefly into the alley behind the tavern carrying scraps toward the waste pile. Morning sunlight finally reaches between the tall apartment buildings overhead, illuminating lines of hanging laundry fluttering gently above the narrow street. The alley smells unbelievable. Rotting vegetables. Wet stone. Wine. Human waste. Smoke drifting from nearby kitchens. And somewhere nearby, leather workers are tanning hides, making everything dramatically worse. A cat watches you from atop a broken barrel with the expression of a tiny emperor personally judging Rome itself. You toss scraps into the refuse pile while flies buzz angrily around your head. Nearby, an old woman empties dirty water into the street while muttering prayers beneath her breath. Nothing in Rome ever truly feels clean. You lean briefly against the wall and close your eyes for a moment. The city noise never disappears completely. Carts. Shouting. Dogs barking. Metal hammering in distant workshops. Somewhere farther away, the roar of crowds already gathering near the market district. Rome feels enormous even when standing still. Then the tavern door swings open again behind you. Kasia steps into the alley holding another cup of wine. You hear about Flavia. You shake your head. Customer hit her last night. You sigh quietly. Bad? Broken tooth. The alley suddenly feels much less warm. Kasia leans beside you against the wall while sunlight creeps slowly higher above the rooftops. Madam says she still has to work tonight. Of course she does. Rome is expensive. Food costs coin. Rent costs coin. Wine costs coin. Survival itself costs coin. And women like you rarely get the luxury of resting simply because pain arrives first. By late afternoon the heat hanging over Rome begins to change. The sunlight softens slightly, but the city itself only grows louder. Shadows stretch across the narrow streets between apartment buildings while taverns near the river begin filling again with sailors, laborers, gamblers, and men looking for distraction before darkness settles over the city. The markets remain crowded. The bathhouses overflow with steam and conversation. Somewhere near the forum, politicians are probably still arguing while ordinary people struggle simply to eat. And for women like you, this is when survival truly begins. The daytime crowd inside the tavern slowly changes as workers finish their labor and evening customers drift in from every direction. Men covered in dust from construction sites. Merchants smelling of perfume and sweat. Dock workers carrying river mud on their sandals. Travelers exhausted from Rome's crowded roads. You stand near the doorway beside Kasia watching the district transform itself for the night. Street vendors light oil lamps beside their carts. Smoke rises from food stalls selling sausages, lentils, roasted fish, and bread brushed with oil. Musicians begin appearing near busy intersections hoping drunk citizens will mistake noise for talent. Children still race through crowded streets despite exhausted mothers threatening violence. Rome after sunset belongs to everybody at once. The rich. The poor. The desperate. The drunk. The lonely. And the dangerous. A warm evening breeze drifts through the alley carrying the smell of roasted meat from nearby food stalls. Your stomach tightens immediately. You realize the small piece of bread from earlier was the only thing you've eaten all day. Kasia notices. You should eat before the crowds get worse. I should own a villa near the coast too, but life remains disappointing. She laughs softly before handing you half a fig from her pouch. It's small. Dry. Probably overpriced. Still the sweetest thing you've tasted all week. The tavern owner suddenly pushes through the doorway carrying a crate of wine cups. Stop standing there looking philosophical and help. You grab the nearest stack before he changes his mind and starts yelling again. Inside, the tavern already feels different from the morning crowd. Daytime drinkers mostly arrive tired. Night drinkers arrive ambitious. Voices grow louder. Laughter becomes rougher. The smell of wine thickens in the warm air while dice games spread across multiple tables like small wars waiting to happen. Near the back wall, a group of chariot racing fans scream at each other about tomorrow's races near the Circus Maximus. One man insists the green faction will dominate. Another swears the blues are unstoppable this season. Honestly, they sound like generals planning military campaigns instead of men arguing over fast horses. A heavy-set merchant waves you over impatiently. Gold rings cover his fingers. His tunic fabric looks expensive enough to feed your entire apartment building for a month. He smiles too widely when you approach. Sit with me. You already know this type. Rich enough to think politeness counts as personality. You lower yourself onto the bench across from him while he pours wine into your cup. Long day, he asks. You glance around the crowded tavern. I work in a tavern in Rome. Every day is long. That makes him laugh harder than the joke deserves. Good. Drunk wealthy men enjoy feeling entertained. He spends several minutes complaining about shipping costs while eating olives aggressively enough to suggest personal hatred toward them. You nod occasionally while your eyes drift toward the doorway where crowds continue moving through the streets outside. Even from inside, Rome feels restless. Wagon wheels grinding against stone. Merchants shouting final prices before nightfall. Music drifting from nearby taverns. The distant roar of crowds near the baths and market squares. The city never truly empties. It only changes shape. The merchant eventually places several coins onto the table beside your hand. More than expected. That immediately improves his personality. You have kind eyes, he says. You stare at him for a moment. My eyes are tired. Still kind. Honestly, close enough. He leaves shortly afterward smelling strongly of wine and expensive oil. You pocket the coins quickly before somebody else notices. Kasia appears beside you almost immediately. How much? You show her briefly. She whistles softly. Jupiter himself must pity you tonight. You tuck the money into your belt. Maybe Jupiter finally feels guilty. Near the center tables, shouting suddenly erupts again. Another dice game collapsing into accusations. One gambler leaps to his feet dramatically pointing at another man's hands. You cheated. I won. Impossible. Around them, customers lean closer eagerly. Roman citizens love entertainment, especially when it threatens violence. The tavern owner storms toward the argument carrying a wooden stick this time instead of a spoon. Progress. The gamblers continue screaming while one sailor nearby begins taking bets on who gets punched first. Rome truly turns everything into business eventually. You slip away toward the street entrance while chaos builds behind you. Outside, evening shadows stretch longer across the district while oil lamps flicker to life beside doorways and market stalls. The city looks softer at night. Still filthy. Still crowded. Still loud enough to wake the gods themselves. But softer somehow. Torchlight reflects across wet stone streets while smoke drifts upward between apartment buildings. The upper windows glow warmly against the darkening sky as voices echo from balconies overhead. Nearby, a food vendor turns skewers of roasting meat over open flames while exhausted workers crowd around with coins already in hand. The smell nearly weakens your knees. A boy carrying bread baskets pushes through the crowd yelling prices while trying not to get robbed. Two musicians play near the corner fountain. One actually sounds talented. The other appears committed entirely to enthusiasm. You lean briefly against the tavern doorway watching Rome move around you. A wealthy couple passes nearby surrounded by servants carrying lamps. Beside them, a beggar sleeps wrapped in torn blankets against a crumbling wall. A group of laborers laugh drunkenly while singing badly enough to frighten birds from nearby rooftops. A woman argues with a fish seller using language powerful enough to start fires. Ancient Rome contains every version of human life at once. Luxury beside hunger. Perfume beside sewage. Marble temples towering above crowded slums. And somewhere inside all that chaos, women like you trying to survive another night. A familiar voice interrupts your thoughts. You hiding from customers? You turn. Livia stands beside the doorway adjusting her shawl while touching the swollen side of her mouth carefully. The bruise near her jaw looks worse now beneath the torchlight. You study her quietly. How bad? She shrugs. I've had worse. The way she says it feels heavier than the words themselves. For a moment neither of you speaks. The noise of Rome continues around you uninterrupted. Finally she exhales slowly. Madam still wants me working tonight. Of course she does. Rooms cost money. Food costs money. Breathing in Rome probably costs money somehow. Livia notices your expression and forces a small smile. Don't look sad. Makes me nervous. You laugh quietly despite yourself. Hard habit to break. She glances toward the crowded tavern behind you. Come on. Evening crowds getting drunk enough to start poetry soon. That immediately ruins the peaceful moment. You follow her back inside while the tavern swells louder beneath torchlight and wine fumes. Night in Rome has officially begun. Night settles fully over Rome, but the city does not grow quiet. If anything, darkness seems to wake another version of it. The streets outside the tavern glow beneath flickering torchlight while shadows stretch across the stone roads between crowded apartment buildings. Music drifts from nearby wine shops. Drunken laughter echoes through narrow alleys. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks endlessly while somebody screams insults from an upper window about stolen sandals. The evening crowd inside the tavern grows thicker by the minute. The air feels heavier now. Hotter. Filled with smoke from oil lamps and the smell of wine spilled across old wooden tables. Sweat shines on foreheads. Dice roll constantly across tabletops while customers shout over one another trying to be heard. Near the back wall, two sailors arm wrestle with the seriousness of military commanders deciding the fate of the empire. One loses immediately and blames the chair. Naturally. You move between crowded tables carrying cups while customers reach for your attention from every direction at once. More wine. Bread here. Another cup. Do you remember me? Unfortunately yes. A musician near the entrance plucks at a lyre while singing about heartbreak in a voice rough enough to sand furniture. Several customers join badly during the chorus. Nobody knows the same words, yet somehow the song survives. Rome rewards confidence more than talent. Kasia brushes past you carrying a tray of watered wine balanced expertly against one hip. Table near the window keeps staring at me, she mutters. You glance briefly. 3 merchants already drunk enough to believe whispering counts as subtlety. At least they're paying customers. For now. One merchant notices you both looking and immediately raises his cup proudly like a victorious gladiator. Kasia rolls her eyes hard enough to deserve applause. Near the kitchen doorway, the cook continues screaming in Greek while smoke pours from another pan behind him. The tavern owner storms past carrying fresh wine jars and threatening violence against anyone who breaks another cup tonight. A crash sounds immediately afterwards somewhere near the entrance. He closes his eyes briefly like a man personally betrayed by fate itself. You hide your smile while moving toward the noise. A young gambler now kneels beside shattered pottery looking genuinely heartbroken over the broken wine cup. That was my lucky cup. The tavern owner stares down at him. It was my cup. Different priorities. The gambler sighs dramatically before stumbling back toward his table where another round of dice immediately begins. Around him, customers continue laughing, shouting, eating, drinking. Rome at night feels endlessly alive. Outside the tavern doorway, crowds still flow through the streets beneath torchlight. Vendors sell roasted chestnuts beside smoking food carts while travelers search for cheap rooms before midnight. Somewhere farther down the road, music and applause erupt from another tavern loud enough to echo between the buildings. You step briefly outside carrying empty dishes toward the alley bins behind the tavern. The cooler night air feels wonderful against your skin after hours inside the crowded room. The alley behind the tavern is darker now except for weak torchlight spilling from nearby windows above. Laundry still hangs overhead between buildings, fluttering gently in the warm night breeze. The smell remains terrible. Some things never improve. Rotting vegetables. Wine. Smoke. Wet stone. River air drifting from the Tiber nearby. And beneath everything else, the heavy crowded smell of too many people living too close together. A figure sits near the far wall wrapped in a faded blanket. An old woman. You recognize her immediately. She sleeps there most nights beside the broken barrel near the alley entrance. Sometimes she sells herbs near the market during daylight hours. Sometimes she simply sits watching crowds pass by as though waiting for somebody who never arrives. Tonight she looks colder than usual. You pause beside her. You eaten? She opens one eye slowly. Have you? Fair question honestly. You hand her the remaining piece of bread tucked inside your belt cloth. She studies it briefly before taking it with careful hands. May Fortuna pity you, she mutters quietly. You glance toward the tavern behind you. She usually doesn't. That earns a dry laugh from her. For a moment the alley feels strangely peaceful despite the distant noise of Rome still roaring beyond it. Then somewhere nearby a drunk man begins singing about goats again and the atmosphere collapses immediately. You return inside carrying fresh cups toward the front tables while the tavern swells even louder beneath torchlight and wine fumes. Near the entrance, a group of racing fans now argue passionately about tomorrow's chariot races. The Greens have the fastest horses. The Blues bribe the officials. The Reds poison competitors. One sailor listening nearby suddenly shouts, "You're all idiots." The argument somehow grows stronger from there. A wealthy customer seated near the wall gestures toward you with two rings flashing beneath the torchlight. Unlike most customers tonight, he looks calm. Expensive robes. Neatly trimmed beard. Perfume strong enough to overpower the tavern smell around him. Rich. Educated. Probably exhausting. You sit beside him while he studies the room with mild amusement. This district never sleeps. You glance around the crowded tavern. If it slept, Rome would probably collapse. That makes him smile. I prefer this part of the city. Why? The rich districts are boring. You nearly laugh. Easy thing to say when you can afford both. He notices your expression immediately. You're judging me. You noticed. Sharp woman. No. Just awake. That earns another quiet laugh from him. Unlike most customers, he doesn't immediately reach for your hand or start describing himself like a heroic statue come to life. Instead he watches the tavern around him while voices rise and fall through the smoky room. You grow up here, he asks eventually. You nod. Near the river. Hard life. You glance toward the crowded room filled with shouting gamblers, sweating laborers, exhausted serving girls, and drunk merchants singing off-key near the doorway. Rome's hard for most people. For a moment neither of you speaks. The tavern noise swirls endlessly around the silence between you. Then a scream erupts from somewhere outside. Not frightened. Angry. Everybody inside pauses briefly before immediately ignoring it again. Normal Roman behavior. The wealthy man sighs softly. Sometimes I think this city eats people alive. You look around the tavern again. At Kasia forcing smiles for customers. At Livia hiding bruises beneath torchlight. At exhausted workers spending their final coins on watered wine before tomorrow arrives and starts the struggle again. Then you look back at him. Sometimes. He has the good sense not to answer that. The hidden economy surrounding a medieval harlot begins long before any customer climbs the stairs of a brothel, because an entire chain of workers, merchants, laborers, and city officials quietly depend upon the trade without ever admitting it publicly, and in most medieval towns the brothel sits not outside the economy but directly inside it, connected to taverns, bakeries, bathhouses, laundries, breweries, markets, landlords, candle makers, tailors, physicians, guards, tax collectors, and even churches, through a constant flow of coin moving beneath the surface of ordinary city life. Every night customers arrive carrying money earned from dozens of different professions: sailors fresh from the docks, merchants returning from trade roads, apprentices spending stolen wages, laborers paid after market day, soldiers carrying military coin, priests pretending nobody recognizes them beneath their cloaks, and travelers looking for food, drink, warmth, conversation, or temporary escape from the brutal exhaustion of medieval existence, and the moment that money enters the brothel it immediately begins spreading outward across the district in every direction. The tavern beside the brothel profits first because most customers drink before climbing upstairs, which means brewers sell more ale, barrel makers receive more work, grain merchants move more product through the market, and tavern boys earn wages hauling heavy casks through muddy streets before sunrise, while nearby bakers profit from feeding workers, customers, guards, servants, and women employed inside the establishment, because crowded nightlife districts consume enormous quantities of cheap bread, stew, onions, fish, and watered ale every single day. Landlords quietly grow wealthy renting deteriorating timber buildings to brothel keepers because red light districts remain crowded regardless of war, plague, famine, or political unrest, and even when city authorities publicly condemn prostitution, they still understand the economic value of keeping such districts operating in controlled areas where customers, gambling, drinking, and violence remain concentrated instead of spreading unpredictably across wealthier neighborhoods. City guards participate in the economy as well, sometimes legally through official taxation and sometimes illegally through bribes collected from brothel owners seeking protection, warning about inspections, or simple freedom from harassment. And in many towns authorities openly license prostitution because regulated brothels generated steady tax income while unofficial establishments created chaos difficult to monitor, meaning the same officials publicly preaching morality during daylight. Often privately benefiting from the industry after dark. Clothing merchants and tailors also profit constantly because women working in brothels require dresses, ribbons, veils, shoes, undergarments, perfumes, pins, combs, mirrors, and fabric repairs far more frequently than ordinary townspeople, especially in districts where appearances directly affect earnings, and even poor establishments still spend money maintaining enough color, decoration, and cleanliness to attract paying customers in crowded competitive streets. Laundresses become essential to the entire system because brothels generate endless amounts of dirty linens, stained blankets, towels, clothing, and bedding needing constant washing, boiling, drying, and repair, while soap makers sell large quantities of harsh cleaning products used to remove odors, blood, wine stains, smoke, and illness from fabrics reused repeatedly inside overcrowded establishments where replacement materials cost too much for regular disposal. Candle makers and oil merchants quietly profit every night because brothels operate long after sunset, consuming enormous amounts of wax candles, animal fat lamps, lamp oil, and firewood to light rooms, heat water, warm customers, and maintain an atmosphere attractive enough to compete with neighboring taverns and gambling houses, especially during long winter months when darkness arrives early and customers spend more hours indoors drinking and spending coin. Bathhouses and public washhouses often develop economic relationships with nearby brothels because women working there require regular washing, grooming, and access to heated water difficult to produce inside cramped rented rooms, while bathhouse owners benefit from steady repeat customers purchasing soap, oils, towels, And private washing spaces despite public moral complaints from religious authorities who frequently criticize both industries together. Physicians, herbalists, midwives, and barber surgeons also earn money through the hidden economy surrounding prostitution because crowded urban brothels create constant demand for treatments related to injury, disease, pregnancy, infections, exhaustion, and physical violence, and while medieval medicine remains dangerously primitive, desperate people still spend coin on herbs, ointments, bloodletting, powders, charms, or questionable miracle cures whenever illness threatens their ability to continue working. Even the church becomes economically entangled despite official condemnation because many brothels donate money during festivals, pay local religious taxes, purchase candles for saints, contribute to charity collections during plague years, or finance funeral costs when workers die without family support, while priests themselves sometimes receive quiet payments to ignore certain activities or avoid publicly targeting profitable districts too aggressively. Market vendors benefit heavily as well because red light districts create concentrated populations needing constant supplies, cooked food, cheap wine, vegetables, meat scraps, blankets, second-hand clothing, pottery, combs, needles, buckets, locks, mattresses, and countless ordinary goods consumed faster in crowded brothel neighborhoods than almost anywhere else in the city, turning these districts into important economic centers even while wealthier citizens publicly pretend they barely exist. Musicians, gamblers, entertainers, cooks, servants, cleaners, stable boys, porters, messengers, and scribes all find occasional employment connected to brothel districts because nightlife economies naturally attract secondary industries built around entertainment, drinking, travel, secrecy, and communication. And in larger medieval cities entire neighborhoods become financially dependent upon the endless nightly circulation of customers seeking distraction from labor, loneliness, war, debt, or ordinary misery. During major fairs, festivals, military campaigns, or trading seasons the economy surrounding prostitution expands dramatically because temporary population surges flood cities with travelers carrying fresh coin, causing brothel keepers to hire additional workers, purchase extra food, rent more rooms, buy additional candles, increase alcohol orders, and pay guards larger bribes to control rising disorder, while nearby businesses simultaneously raise prices knowing demand will remain high, regardless of cost. Even after death the economic chain continues because funeral workers, gravediggers, coffin makers, priests, and cemetery caretakers often handle the burials of women who die without family support, while second-hand merchants purchase and resell clothing, jewelry, bedding, furniture, and personal belongings from closed brothels or deceased workers, ensuring almost nothing inside the medieval urban economy truly goes unused for long. The hidden economy of the medieval harlot therefore extends far beyond individual transactions between customer and worker because entire sections of medieval urban life quietly depend upon the movement of money through red light districts, with thousands of ordinary laborers, merchants, landlords, officials, craftsmen, servants, and suppliers earning income indirectly from an industry society publicly condemned while privately sustaining through constant participation. You wake before the church bells because the woman beside you is already crying, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly into the blanket while weak morning light slips through the shutters of the rented room above the bakery, and outside the city is still cold and half asleep, but inside this cramped chamber the air already feels heavy with panic, regret, and the terrifying realization that romance in medieval Europe is tangled inside rules most people barely understand until it is too late. The woman whispers that her father found the ribbon, just a narrow strip of blue cloth tied around her wrist during the harvest festival by a miller's son who smiled too confidently and danced too closely after too much ale, and in another century perhaps it would mean nothing at all, but here a ribbon can become evidence, suspicion, negotiation, or scandal depending entirely on who notices it first, because love during the Middle Ages rarely belongs only to the people involved, families interfere constantly. Neighbors whisper behind shutters, priests lecture from pulpits, and local courts sometimes involve themselves in matters as small as a promise exchanged beside a market stall during sunset. Outside the window the baker downstairs begins shouting at apprentices while carts rattle through muddy streets below, and already women carrying water buckets pause beside alleyways exchanging rumors collected before sunrise because medieval towns survive on gossip almost as much as bread, and once a rumor begins moving through a district it spreads faster than smoke through dry timber. The girl beside you keeps whispering that her father will force her into marriage before winter arrives now that people are talking, and honestly she may be correct because strange laws surrounding romance exist everywhere across medieval Europe, changing from kingdom to kingdom, village to village, sometimes even between neighboring towns depending on local customs, church authority, noble influence, and how aggressively officials decide to interfere in private life. In some regions merely exchanging vows privately could create a legally recognized marriage if witnesses later testified the promises were spoken sincerely enough, which meant careless declarations during emotional moments occasionally transformed into bitter legal disputes argued before church courts months later, while elsewhere giving repeated gifts like gloves, ribbons, rings, embroidered cloth, or carved tokens could convince entire communities that formal courtship already existed whether the couple intended it or not. A young man walking repeatedly beside the same woman after evening prayers might trigger suspicion immediately, especially in smaller towns where everybody notices patterns, and many priests openly warned that unsupervised affection encouraged immorality, temptation, and social disorder, so fathers guarded daughters carefully while brothers watched strangers with exhausting paranoia because marriage affected inheritance, land ownership, business alliances, dowries, labor agreements, and family reputation all at once. The baker downstairs slams his oven shut hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling beams while somewhere farther away church bells finally begin echoing across the rooftops, and already the streets below grow louder with merchants, laborers, servants, and apprentices flooding into the market district carrying baskets, tools, barrels, or bundles of firewood through freezing morning air. Yet inside the room the conversation remains trapped around ribbons, fathers, gossip, and the terrifying reality that a single dance during a festival might permanently reshape an entire future. The girl explains that her father has already begun negotiating with an older widower owning 2 sheep pastures beyond the river, a practical man with missing teeth but stable income, while the miller's son owns nothing except strong arms and dangerous confidence. And suddenly the difference between romantic stories and ordinary medieval life becomes painfully obvious because most marriages are built around survival first and affection second, especially among peasants and laboring families struggling to endure famine, taxation, disease, and brutal winters. Throughout medieval Europe countless strange customs attempt to regulate affection in ways modern people would consider absurd, including restrictions on marriages during certain holy seasons, rules forbidding weddings too close to major feast days, requirements demanding public announcements before ceremonies, and laws insisting marriages occur openly before witnesses so secret unions cannot threaten inheritance disputes later. In some places couples caught meeting privately too often could face public humiliation organized by church authorities determined to discourage scandal, while elsewhere communities practiced noisy nighttime rituals called chivalry where crowds gathered outside homes banging pots, ringing bells, and shouting insults at relationships considered immoral, suspicious, unequal, or socially disruptive, especially marriages involving large age differences, widows remarrying too quickly, or couples accused of adultery. The girl pulls the blanket tighter around herself while explaining that her cousin once became trapped in endless gossip simply for meeting a stable hand beside the river path after sunset several times during spring, and eventually village rumors became so relentless that the local priest forced immediate marriage simply to preserve public morality before the scandal spread further. Because medieval society fears uncontrolled romance almost as much as criminal behavior. Love creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates disputes. Disputes threaten order. And order matters deeply in communities where survival already hangs by a thread during bad harvests or outbreaks of disease. Outside the bakery footsteps splash through muddy streets while smoke rises from ovens into pale morning air, and somewhere nearby a fishmonger already screams about stolen eels while apprentices drag ale barrels toward taverns preparing for another exhausting day. Yet inside the tiny rented chamber the conversation grows heavier because the girl suddenly asks whether anybody anywhere truly marries for love. You hesitate before answering because medieval Europe certainly celebrates romance in poems, songs, and stories about knights risking everything for noblewomen, but ordinary reality rarely resembles those tales, especially for peasants, servants, artisans, laborers, or daughters whose marriages often function more like survival arrangements negotiated between families. A butcher's daughter may marry a baker's son because combining businesses improves stability. A farmer may arrange his children's futures years in advance to secure land agreements. Widows frequently remarry quickly because surviving alone proves financially dangerous. Young women sometimes enter convents not from spiritual calling but to escape unwanted husbands chosen entirely for economic convenience. And throughout all of it the Church insists marriage remains sacred, permanent, and legally binding even while actual human relationships continue behaving unpredictably. The girl finally wipes her eyes and stares toward the ceiling while downstairs somebody begins laughing loudly in the bakery below, and for a moment the room grows quiet except for distant bells echoing through the city, but then she whispers the question truly haunting her. What if I refuse? And suddenly every strange law about romance in medieval Europe stops feeling distant or theoretical because refusal itself carries consequences in many communities where family authority outweighs personal desire, especially for women whose futures remain tightly controlled by fathers, brothers, guardians, or husbands expected to manage household reputation carefully. Some daughters who resisted arranged marriages faced confinement inside homes or convents until relatives forced obedience through pressure, threats, or exhaustion, while others fled secretly with lovers despite knowing such actions could provoke lawsuits, family feuds, violent retaliation, or accusations of abduction depending entirely on local law and social status. Elopement becomes especially dangerous because many medieval authorities treat marriage less as private affection and more as a public contract affecting property rights, inheritance claims, taxes, labor obligations, and political alliances, meaning unauthorized relationships can create chaos extending far beyond the couple themselves. In certain regions a man accused of seducing a woman under promise of marriage could face legal punishment if the relationship damaged her reputation without resulting in formal union, while elsewhere families demanded financial compensation when daughters lost socially valuable marriage prospects due to scandal or rumors surrounding courtship gone wrong. Even kissing carries surprising legal and social weight in some communities because public displays of affection often signal intentions far more serious than modern people might expect, especially in villages where privacy barely exists and neighbors observe one another constantly through windows, church gatherings, communal wells, shared ovens, and crowded market spaces. The girl explains that during last year's midsummer festival 2 young lovers disappeared briefly into nearby woods after dancing, and by sunrise half the town already believed marriage negotiations were underway despite neither family approving the match, while older women spent weeks debating whether the girl involved still counted as respectable enough for other suitors afterward. Rumors become their own form of law in medieval life because reputation shapes opportunities constantly, and once gossip attaches itself to somebody it rarely disappears completely no matter how false or exaggerated the original story becomes. Outside the city continues growing louder while sunlight slowly reaches the upper windows across the alley, illuminating smoke drifting above crowded rooftops where washerwomen hang linens beside chimney stacks and children chase each other between muddy puddles below, yet inside the room the girl's fear continues building because she understands something terrifying about medieval romance. People remember everything. Who danced together, walked together, exchanged gifts, smiled too warmly during church festivals, lingered too long beside the well after sunset. And those memories eventually become stories repeated during meals, weddings, funerals, harvest feasts, and winter nights beside fireplaces until gossip hardens into accepted truth whether accurate or not. The girl whispers that her father already suspects she allowed the miller's son to kiss her during the festival. You ask quietly whether he did. She stares at the blanket for several seconds before answering. Yes. Just one word. Small enough to fit inside the freezing room. Heavy enough to alter an entire future. The truth about romance in medieval Europe begins long before anybody falls in love because most people are already trapped inside rules created by family expectations, church authority, property concerns, inheritance laws, survival needs, and public reputation before they even reach adulthood, and while poets sing about passion beside moonlit castles the average person experiences romance as something watched, negotiated, judged, and controlled by nearly everybody around them. A young woman waking inside a medieval town does not simply think about affection or attraction, she thinks about dowries, family honor, marriage prospects, gossip spreading through market streets, whether neighbors noticed who walked her home after evening prayers, whether her father approves of a certain apprentice, whether the local priest believes she behaves modestly enough, and whether one careless mistake might permanently damage her reputation in a community where people remember scandal for decades. At the same time, young men face their own pressures because romance without income means very little in medieval society, and a laborer may genuinely love somebody while fully understanding he cannot realistically marry until he owns tools, land, trade skills, stable wages, or family approval strong enough to convince relatives the marriage will not end in starvation during winter. Meaning affection constantly collides with economic reality in ways romantic stories rarely acknowledge. Throughout medieval Europe, strange customs and local laws shape relationships differently from region to region, but nearly everywhere courtship remains highly public because privacy barely exists in crowded villages and cities where people live close together, work together, worship together, and observe one another constantly through shared wells, communal ovens, church gatherings, festivals, markets, and taverns, meaning even small interactions quickly become public knowledge. A ribbon tied around somebody's wrist during a festival may trigger rumors lasting months, repeated conversations beside a market stall can attract suspicion, and dancing too closely during celebrations sometimes convinces entire communities that marriage negotiations already exist whether the couple intended such seriousness or not, because medieval society treats visible affection as meaningful evidence rather than harmless behavior. Church authorities involve themselves deeply in romance as well because marriage is considered sacred and legally binding, which means priests often monitor relationships carefully while preaching against lust, adultery, secret unions, and inappropriate courtship, yet the reality remains complicated because human behavior rarely follows religious ideals perfectly, especially during festivals involving music, wine, dancing, and overcrowded celebrations where young people finally escape parental supervision briefly. In some regions, verbal promises exchanged privately between couples can later become recognized as valid marriage agreements if witnesses testify the vows sounded sincere enough, leading to bitter legal disputes argued before church courts when relationships collapse or families object afterward, while elsewhere secret engagements, exchanged gifts, or physical intimacy may pressure communities into forcing marriages simply to preserve social order and avoid scandal. Parents frequently arrange marriages based less on emotion and more on survival because combining land, businesses, livestock, labor, trade connections, or political alliances matters enormously in societies where famine, disease, war, and taxation constantly threaten stability. Meaning daughters especially often possess limited control over their futures while fathers negotiate practical matches with frightening efficiency. A widowed merchant with secure income may appear far more desirable to a family than a poor young man deeply in love, because medieval households prioritize survival above romance, and many parents honestly believe financial stability offers greater protection than emotional happiness ever could. At the same time, romantic desire still exists everywhere beneath these restrictions because human beings remain human regardless of century, so despite surveillance, social pressure, and religious control, people continue flirting during festivals, exchanging letters secretly, meeting beside rivers after sunset, kissing in hidden corners during crowded celebrations, and risking enormous consequences simply to experience affection freely for brief moments. This constant tension between desire and restriction shapes medieval romance more than poetry ever admits. Young couples develop elaborate ways to communicate quietly through gestures, ribbons, songs, flowers, shared prayers, festival traditions, and carefully timed meetings because direct courtship often attracts dangerous attention, especially for women whose reputations remain fragile within communities eager for gossip. Rumors themselves become powerful forms of social control because once suspicion spreads through a village or city district, it can damage marriage prospects permanently, and women particularly face brutal judgment regarding chastity, modesty, and public behavior, while men often receive far greater freedom despite church teachings condemning immoral conduct equally. Public humiliation rituals sometimes target relationships considered scandalous or socially disruptive, including noisy nighttime gatherings where crowds mock unsuitable marriages, suspected adultery, widows remarrying too quickly, or couples violating local expectations, demonstrating how entire communities actively police romance through shame as much as law. Even weddings themselves often reflect economic and social priorities more than private emotion because ceremonies involve negotiations over dowries, property transfers, inheritance arrangements, feast expenses, family alliances, and public reputation, while the actual couple sometimes appear almost secondary beside the surrounding financial concerns. Yet despite all this pressure, people still fall genuinely in love, still experience heartbreak, jealousy, obsession, longing, betrayal, desire, and devotion exactly as humans always have, except medieval lovers must navigate those emotions inside societies where private feelings rarely remain private for long and where romance can affect not only individual happiness but entire families' futures. The truth about romance in medieval Europe therefore lies somewhere between the fantasy sung by wandering musicians and the harsh reality imposed by survival, because while poetry celebrates passion freely crossing every boundary, ordinary medieval life constantly reminds people that love alone rarely controls destiny. The beauty rituals of ancient Egyptian queens begin in darkness long before the sun rises above the Nile because inside the royal palace appearance is treated almost like a sacred ceremony, and while ordinary workers outside still sleep beneath mud brick roofs, the queen's chambers are already glowing softly with oil lamps, incense smoke, polished gold, and the quiet movement of servants preparing perfumes, cosmetics, wigs, linen robes, and carved alabaster bowls filled with scented oils gathered from across Egypt's vast trade routes. The palace feels cool for only a brief moment before dawn because Egypt's heat never truly disappears, and the stone floors beneath bare feet still carry warmth from the previous day while attendants move silently through painted corridors decorated with blue lotus flowers, falcons, reeds, and golden sun stretching across the walls like pieces of living mythology. A servant parts the linen curtains carefully. Another kneels beside shallow basins of water. Another crushes minerals against a stone pallet with slow deliberate movements while the sound echoes faintly through the chamber like tiny grinding thunder before sunrise. Nothing about royal beauty happens quickly here. Every gesture feels practiced across generations. Every jar contains expensive ingredients gathered through trade, conquest, tribute, or ritual preparation. The queen herself sits quietly upon a carved wooden chair inlaid with ivory while two attendants begin loosening the braids woven tightly through her hair during the previous evening's banquet, and already the room smells richly of myrrh, lotus oil, cinnamon, honey, warm beeswax, incense smoke, and the faint mineral scent of powdered cosmetics waiting nearby inside tiny decorated containers. Outside beyond the palace walls the Nile remains dark and calm beneath fading stars while fishermen prepare nets along the riverbanks and laborers begin lighting cooking fires in the crowded city streets, but inside the royal chambers the morning belongs entirely to ritual because beauty in ancient Egypt is deeply connected to order, purity, spirituality, and status, especially for queens expected to appear almost divine before priests, nobles, diplomats, and servants throughout the day. Warm water is poured slowly into shallow alabaster basins while natron salts are mixed carefully with oils and soft clay to cleanse the queen's skin, and attendants scrub away dust, sweat, perfume residue, and traces of old cosmetics because Egyptian beauty rituals always begin with cleanliness, something associated not only with appearance but also with health, discipline, and religious purity. The water glimmers softly beneath oil lamp light. Gold bracelets clink quietly against ceramic bowls. Linen cloth slides gently across skin while servants work with astonishing patience learned through years inside palace service. Milk and honey are blended together next, spread carefully across the queen's arms and face in cooling layers while attendants fan the chamber slowly with palm leaves to soften the oppressive heat already beginning to rise outside, and stories about queens bathing in milk survive for centuries afterward because wealthy Egyptian women truly believe these treatments preserve softness, youth, and radiance beneath the brutal desert climate. Nearby another servant grinds red ochre into fine powder while black coal waits inside tiny carved jars beside polished bronze mirrors reflecting flickering light across the room, and every cosmetic ingredient carries importance because Egyptian makeup exists somewhere between medicine, ritual protection, and decoration all at once. The queen's eyes receive the greatest attention. Always the eyes. Ancient Egyptians believed the eyes hold spiritual power connected to protection, health, and divine symbolism, so attendants prepare the dark kohl carefully using crushed galena minerals mixed with oils until the paste becomes smooth enough for precise application beneath the lower eyelids and across the corners of the eyes in long elegant lines instantly recognizable thousands of years later in murals, statues, and tomb paintings buried beneath desert sand. One servant steadies the queen's chin gently. Another holds the mirror at the correct angle. Then the kohl stick moves slowly outward with practiced precision while the chamber remains almost silent except for distant footsteps echoing through palace corridors and the faint hiss of incense burning nearby. The makeup serves practical purposes too because Egypt's relentless sunlight, dust, insects, and infections constantly threaten the eyes, and many Egyptians believe kohl protects against glare, irritation, disease, and even evil spirits watching from the unseen world. Green malachite pigment follows beneath the eyes afterward while red ochre colors the lips and cheeks softly, creating warmth against the queen's skin while gold dust catches faint morning light beginning to slip through the curtains as sunrise approaches across the Nile Valley. Nearby the hairdressers prepare wigs upon carved stands shaped like human heads. Heavy black wigs. Long braided wigs. Perfumed wigs decorated with beads, ribbons, tiny gold ornaments, and fresh lotus petals gathered before dawn from palace gardens. Hair in ancient Egypt carries enormous social importance because elaborate wigs symbolize status, wealth, refinement, and beauty, especially among nobles and royalty expected to appear flawless during ceremonies, festivals, diplomatic meetings, and religious processions. The queen's natural hair has already been washed with oils and scented herbs before being braided tightly against the scalp beneath linen wraps, and now attendants carefully secure the wig above it using ivory pins while adjusting each braid with astonishing precision until every detail appears symmetrical beneath the growing sunlight entering the chamber. Perfume becomes the final transformation. Tiny alabaster jars are opened one by one revealing thick scented oils imported through Egyptian trade routes stretching toward Nubia, Punt, the Sinai deserts, and distant Mediterranean ports, and the room grows even richer with fragrance as servants massage lotus oil, myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, cedar, and floral resins across the queen's skin, wrists, neck, and hair. Perfume cones made from wax, incense, fat, and aromatic resin are then placed carefully atop the wig itself where Egypt's heat will slowly melt them throughout the day, releasing fragrance continuously during ceremonies and banquets while sweet smoke drifts gently around the queen wherever she walks. The smell inside the chamber becomes almost overwhelming now. Honey. Smoke. Flowers. Warm oils. Incense burning beside polished gold. Sweet perfume mixing with desert heat and stone walls slowly warming beneath sunrise. Outside the palace the ordinary city awakens fully while donkeys pull carts through dusty streets and merchants arrange vegetables, fish, bread, linen, pottery, and spices beneath market awnings near the river, yet inside the royal chambers beauty rituals continue with jewelry. Gold collars. Lapis lazuli necklaces. Turquoise beads. Carnelian bracelets. Rings shaped like sacred symbols. Every piece placed carefully upon the queen's body not merely as decoration but as visible proof of divine favor, royal power, wealth, and connection to the gods themselves. Egyptian queens are expected to embody order in human form. Grace. Balance. Radiance. Fertility. Protection. The ideal image of civilization standing against chaos beyond the Nile. Even cosmetic containers themselves appear beautiful enough for temples because wealthy Egyptians store makeup inside carved ivory boxes, painted ceramic jars, polished stone palettes, and delicate glass vessels shaped like animals, flowers, birds, or sacred symbols, while mirrors made from polished bronze reflect shimmering light across painted walls. Servants continue adjusting the queen's appearance for hours before public ceremonies begin because royal beauty is never treated casually, and every detail matters, from the exact darkness of the kohl around the eyes to the arrangement of beads woven through the wig and the fragrance lingering in the air around her as she moves through palace halls. Priests waiting nearby in temple courtyards understand this perfectly because appearance in ancient Egypt is connected directly to spirituality and divine order, meaning the queen must appear worthy not only before nobles and foreign envoys but before the gods themselves. That is why cosmetic tools appear so often inside tombs discovered centuries later beneath desert sands. Coal jars, perfume vessels, mirrors, combs, wigs, oils. Because Egyptians believe beauty should continue into eternity. The dead are prepared carefully for the afterlife just as the living prepare themselves each morning within palace chambers beside the Nile. And now as sunlight finally floods across the columns outside, illuminating drifting incense smoke and golden jewelry resting against linen robes, the queen rises slowly from the carved chair transformed completely, eyes darkened like painted falcons, skin glowing with perfumed oil, wig scented with lotus and myrrh, gold shining against warm skin beneath the Egyptian sun. Not merely beautiful. Almost divine. You are standing beside the Dnieper River on a freezing morning while hundreds of people gather silently near the water beneath the command of Prince Vladimir, and nobody fully understands yet that they are watching the death of the old pagan world of Rus happen in real time because the wooden gods that stood above Kiev for generations are already being torn down behind them, dragged through mud by ropes while warriors shout and priests from Byzantium raise crosses toward the grey northern sky. The riverbank smells of wet earth, smoke, pine wood, river water, sweat, and fear while crowds press together beneath the fortress hills of Kiev, mothers holding children close beside old men wrapped in heavy fur cloaks, merchants whispering nervously beside carts of grain and wax, warriors gripping spear shafts with suspicious eyes fixed upon the foreign priest standing near Prince Vladimir himself. And only days earlier the great idol of Pr0 still stood above the city as protector of thunder, war, and rulers until Vladimir ordered the statue ripped down and beaten with sticks before being thrown toward the current while horrified pagans watched silently, unable to stop what was happening because the prince who once worshipped the old gods more fiercely than anyone had suddenly turned against them. That is what terrifies the people most because the ruler ordering the baptism of Rus is not a peaceful monk or holy saint descending from distant churches but a hardened warrior prince shaped by violence, conquest, raids, feasts, pagan sacrifice, and ruthless ambition, a man feared across the northern lands long before anybody associates his name with Christianity. Years earlier Kiev looks very different from the Christian city it will eventually become because the world Vladimir inherits is raw, brutal, and deeply pagan, a river kingdom balanced between endless forests and trade routes stretching from the Baltic north toward the enormous wealth of Constantinople far to the south, and every morning smoke rises from timber houses crowded along muddy streets while traders unload furs, honey, silver, slaves, and wax from longboats emerging through thick fog, drifting across the Dnieper River. The city smells constantly of wet wood, horse sweat, fish, ale, mud, smoke, and cold river air while blacksmiths hammer iron beside crowded markets and warriors wearing fur cloaks move through narrow streets carrying axes stained from recent campaigns, and above the city sacred fires burn before towering pagan idols carved from oak while priests offer sacrifices seeking protection from gods believed to rule storms, harvests, war, death, rivers, forests, and the dangerous unseen forces haunting the northern wilderness. The people of Rus grow up believing spirits move through every part of the natural world because forests feel alive after dark, rivers seem capable of swallowing entire villages during spring floods, thunder sounds like divine anger rolling across the sky, and wolves howling beyond firelight during winter nights remind everyone how fragile survival truly is in the harsh northern land surrounding Kiev. This is the world that shapes Vladimir from childhood, a violent frontier society where rulers maintain authority through fear, military success, wealth, and tribute rather than written law or religious morality. And when civil war erupts between the sons of Prince Sviatoslav after his death the struggle becomes savage even by medieval standards because rival princes command hardened warriors loyal mainly to victory and plunder. Bloodshed follows Vladimir's rise to power across the lands of Rus as cities burn, alliances collapse, rival claimants die, and entire regions shift loyalty according to whichever prince appears strongest, until Vladimir finally secures Kiev itself and begins ruling as one of the most feared leaders in Eastern Europe. Stories surrounding him spread quickly through trade routes and villages because he develops reputation for excess, violence, military ambition, pagan devotion, and enormous appetites, surrounding himself with feasts, warriors, women, and ritual ceremonies dedicated to the old gods while strengthening pagan worship across his territories through large public shrines overlooking Kiev itself. The idol of Pr0 becomes especially important under Vladimir because the thunder god represents strength, warfare, kingship, and victory, values deeply respected within the warrior culture of Rus, and sacrifices continue beneath the sacred statues while smoke rises toward northern skies and priests chant prayers beside crowds of armed men seeking divine favor before raids and military campaigns. Yet beyond the borders of Rus another civilization exerts growing influence through wealth, religion, diplomacy, and culture because Constantinople stands far to the south like something almost unimaginable to northern travelers arriving from muddy wooden settlements beside frozen rivers. The Byzantine capital overwhelms visitors with massive walls, crowded harbors, marble streets, towering churches glowing with gold mosaics, incense-filled ceremonies, educated priests, imperial armies, and endless displays of wealth flowing through the richest Christian empire in the medieval world, and merchants traveling between Rus and Byzantium carry more than goods through the river trade routes because they also carry stories. Stories about churches brighter than palaces. Stories about emperors ruling through divine authority. Stories about ceremonies so beautiful visitors believe heaven itself has descended upon earth. Those stories eventually reach Vladimir's court where political reality begins pushing the prince toward difficult decisions because religion in the medieval world is never simply personal belief but a source of legitimacy, alliances, diplomacy, literacy, administration, and international power, and a pagan ruler surrounded increasingly by organized Christian states risks isolation over time. According to later chronicles, Vladimir begins examining different religions while envoys arrive representing foreign faiths hoping to influence the future of Rus itself, and although later writers add legendary details to these meetings, the political importance remains undeniable because whichever religion Vladimir chooses may permanently shape the direction of his kingdom. Representatives connected to Islam arrive from the Volga Bulgars while Jewish envoys speak about their traditions, and Christian emissaries appear from both Western Europe and Byzantium, each attempting to persuade the prince through arguments about truth, power, morality, civilization, and divine favor. The famous story describing Vladimir rejecting Islam because of restrictions against alcohol becomes legendary centuries later because it reflects the heavy drinking culture of Rus warrior society where feasts and ale remain deeply tied to politics, loyalty, celebration, and masculine identity. Although historians understand the prince's final decision likely depends far more upon political advantage than personal taste. Byzantium offers something no other power can provide. Connection to the greatest empire in Eastern Christianity. Prestige capable of transforming Vladimir from pagan warlord into internationally recognized Christian monarch. Access to literacy, priests, administration, architecture, diplomacy, and religious authority strong enough to unify the fractured territories of Rus beneath a stronger central identity. The turning point finally arrives through war as much as religion because Vladimir launches campaigns connected to Byzantine politics and eventually captures the important city of Chersonesos in Crimea, placing pressure upon the Byzantine emperors during moments of internal instability while simultaneously negotiating marriage into the imperial family itself. Such a marriage would have seemed astonishing to many people across Europe because Byzantine princesses rarely marry foreign rulers considered uncivilized outsiders by the empire, especially northern pagan princes from distant river kingdoms, yet Vladimir's military strength and political importance forced the Byzantines into negotiations. The bride is Anna, sister of the Byzantine emperors. The condition is conversion. Baptism. Christianization. Vladimir agrees, and with that decision the old pagan world of Rus begins collapsing beneath the rising power of Christianity. Vladimir's baptism does not instantly erase the pagan soul of Rus because belief shaped across generations cannot disappear in a single morning beside the Dnieper River, and although the prince has accepted Christianity and ordered the destruction of the old idols, the people standing waist-deep in freezing water still carry memories of sacred forests, sacrifice fires, thunder gods, river spirits, winter rituals, and ancient fears tied to the natural world surrounding them since childhood. The crowds along the riverbank move slowly beneath the supervision of warriors and priests while Byzantine clergy raise crosses toward the gray sky and chant prayers unfamiliar to many people hearing them for the first time, and the atmosphere feels tense rather than joyful because most villagers gathered beside the river understand this moment is not optional. Prince Vladimir watches from higher ground near the priests while members of his court stand beside him wrapped in heavy cloaks against the cold wind blowing across the water, and the ruler who once promoted pagan worship across Kiev now oversees the complete transformation of his kingdom with the same determination that once helped him seize power through warfare and political violence. Some people enter the river willingly hoping loyalty to the prince will bring protection or opportunity within the growing Christian order while others obey simply because refusing publicly risks punishment, suspicion, or accusations of rebellion against Vladimir himself. And throughout the crowded riverbanks whispers move through the people as old women clutch charms hidden beneath clothing and warriors exchange uncertain glances while children cry beside nervous parents. The baptism continues for hours beneath dark northern clouds while priests move among the crowd speaking prayers and lowering people into the cold current of the Dnieper, and above the city smoke still rises from shattered pagan shrines where sacred idols once stood before Vladimir ordered them destroyed. The destruction of Pr0 leaves especially deep scars across Kiev because the thunder god represented power, warfare, kingship, and divine protection for generations of warriors, and many people struggle to understand how the mighty god who once stood above the city could now lie broken in mud beside the river after being dragged through the streets under orders from the same prince who once honored him with sacrifice and ritual. Yet fear of Vladimir outweighs loyalty to the old religion for many people because the prince remains a ruler shaped by conquest and military authority rather than peaceful persuasion, and his decision to convert carries enormous political weight beyond spiritual belief since Christianity offers access to alliances, literacy, diplomacy, administration, and legitimacy connected to the Byzantine Empire. That connection to Byzantium changes the future of Rus almost immediately because priests, scribes, artists, and religious officials begin arriving from the south carrying books, icons, relics, liturgical traditions, and knowledge unfamiliar to most people living across the northern river kingdoms. And suddenly Kiev becomes linked not only to trade routes but to the enormous cultural and religious world centered around Constantinople. Churches begin rising across the city where pagan shrines once stood while Christian symbols appear inside royal ceremonies and public life, and although most buildings in Kiev remain wooden, the influence of Byzantine architecture slowly reshapes the appearance of sacred spaces through domes, icons, painted walls, candles, incense, mosaics, and formal rituals unlike anything previously associated with the old pagan traditions. The sound of church bells gradually becomes part of daily life in places where ritual drums and pagan chants once dominated ceremonies, and younger generations growing up after Vladimir's conversion begin learning Christian prayers instead of ancient invocations to Pr0 or Veles while priests teach new ideas about sin, salvation, morality, marriage, death, and divine authority. Even burial customs begin changing across the lands of Rus because pagan cremations and grave rituals slowly give way to Christian funerals directed by clergy, and cemeteries develop around churches where crosses replace older symbols tied to the pagan understanding of the afterlife. Still, the old beliefs refuse to disappear completely because rural villages scattered across forests, rivers, and isolated northern territories remain deeply attached to older traditions connected to harvest cycles, natural spirits, sacred trees, protective rituals, and local customs older than Christianity itself. And many people quietly continue practicing elements of pagan religion even while publicly accepting baptism. Priests traveling into remote settlements often encounter villagers mixing Christian prayer with ancient superstitions because the spiritual world of medieval Rus remains layered and complicated, especially in places far from Kiev where survival matters more than theological purity and where people continue fearing storms, disease, famine, wolves, drought, and unseen forces believed to move through the wilderness surrounding their homes. Sacred groves once dedicated to pagan gods sometimes remain untouched because local communities still fear angering ancient spirits, while other sites become transformed into Christian locations through churches built directly upon older holy ground in an attempt to absorb pagan traditions into the new religion rather than fight endless resistance. Seasonal festivals also survive beneath Christian names because many celebrations tied to harvests, winter endings, spring fertility, and midsummer rituals remain too deeply rooted in daily life to erase entirely, and over time Christianity in Rus develops alongside traces of older beliefs hidden beneath ceremonies, songs, folk customs, and superstitions surviving quietly through generations. Meanwhile, Prince Vladimir carefully reshapes his own public image because conversion requires more than personal baptism if the new religion is to strengthen royal authority across the kingdom, and chroniclers connected to the church begin presenting him not as a violent pagan warlord but as a divinely guided Christian ruler responsible for bringing civilization and true faith to the lands of Rus. Stories describing his earlier brutality remain known yet gradually become overshadowed by religious narratives portraying transformation, redemption, wisdom, and holy leadership, and Vladimir's reign starts being remembered not only through warfare and conquest but through the creation of a Christian kingdom tied spiritually and politically to Byzantium. The marriage between Vladimir and the Byzantine princess Anna reinforces this transformation powerfully because her arrival in Kiev symbolizes the integration of Rus into the Christian world of Eastern Europe. And for many people across neighboring kingdoms the union appears astonishing considering how recently Vladimir himself represented pagan northern warrior culture viewed as barbaric by the sophisticated courts of Constantinople. Greek clergy now move through the streets of Kiev beside Slavic nobles while Christian texts are copied by scribes learning literacy through church traditions imported from Byzantium, and the influence of Orthodox Christianity begins shaping art, politics, education, architecture, law, and royal ideology throughout the expanding territories controlled by Rus. Yet beneath all these changes memory lingers stubbornly among the people. Old warriors still remember standing before sacred idols during pagan ceremonies before raids and battles. Old villagers remember offerings left beside rivers during harsh winters. Old priests remember chants once spoken beneath oak trees sacred to Pr0stitute. And far from Kiev and forests where church authority remains weak the old gods continue surviving inside stories, fears, rituals, and whispered traditions passed quietly from one generation to the next even as Christianity spread steadily across the kingdom created by Prince Vladimir beside the cold waters of the Dnieper River. Long before Eleanor of Aquitaine became one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, before kings fought over her inheritance, before crusades carried her across continents, and before chroniclers debated whether she was brilliant or dangerously ambitious, she was simply a child growing up in the warm and wealthy lands of Aquitaine. And Aquitaine did not feel like the rest of medieval Europe. The south of France was softer, brighter, and more alive than the colder northern kingdoms beyond the Loire. Sunlight rolled across vineyards and green valleys. Rivers wound slowly through fertile countryside while stone castles overlooked forests, villages, and busy trade roads carrying merchants, pilgrims, knights, and wandering musicians from one court to another. In many ways, Aquitaine still carried echoes of the old Roman world. Its noble courts valued poetry, music, diplomacy, and aristocratic refinement in ways that distinguished it from the harsher feudal culture of northern Europe. Troubadours traveled between castles singing stories of love, loyalty, heartbreak, and heroic deeds. Noble feasts stretched deep into the night beneath torchlight while musicians played harps and lutes before crowded banquet tables. This was the world Eleanor entered around the year 1122. She was likely born in Poitiers, one of the great cultural centers of medieval France. Her father, William X, ruled one of the richest and most influential territories in Europe. Aquitaine itself was enormous, stretching across much of southwestern France. Its lands contained fertile farmland, prosperous towns, vineyards, forests, monasteries, and powerful castles guarding major trade routes. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry II of England in 1152, the political balance of Western Europe shifted almost instantly. The marriage was not simply another dynastic alliance between noble houses. It created one of the largest and most powerful political domains medieval Europe had yet seen. Through inheritance, conquest, and marriage, Henry now controlled territories stretching from the Scottish border deep into southern France. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Aquitaine together formed a vast interconnected realm historians would later call the Angevin Empire. And at the center of that empire stood Eleanor. The speed of the marriage shocked Europe. Only weeks had passed since the annulment of her marriage to Louis VII of France. To some observers, the union seemed reckless or scandalous. To others, it appeared brilliantly calculated. Eleanor had moved with remarkable decisiveness inside a political world where hesitation could mean vulnerability, abduction, or the loss of power. Henry himself was unlike Louis in almost every way. Where Louis had been quiet, cautious, and deeply religious, Henry was energetic, intelligent, restless, and intensely ambitious. Chroniclers described him as constantly in motion. He traveled endlessly across his territories, held long councils, hunted aggressively, negotiated tirelessly, and involved himself personally in nearly every aspect of governance. He possessed enormous political ability. And Eleanor immediately recognized it. Together they formed one of the most formidable royal partnerships in Europe, though beneath the surface their relationship also carried the seeds of future conflict. Both were ambitious. Both understood power deeply. Both possessed strong personalities unwilling to remain secondary within the marriage. At first, however, the union appeared extraordinarily successful. In 1154, Henry became King of England following the death of Stephen, King of England, and Eleanor was crowned Queen of England beside him at Westminster Abbey. For Eleanor, this marked the beginning of an entirely new phase of life. She was no longer merely Duchess of Aquitaine or former Queen of France. She now stood beside the ruler of a transcontinental empire whose territories crossed languages, customs, and regional identities. Governing such enormous lands required constant movement. The royal court itself rarely remained in one place for long. Unlike later monarchies centered permanently around fixed capitals, medieval royal government was mobile. Henry and Eleanor traveled continuously between castles, cities, monasteries, and administrative centers. Royal authority depended upon presence. Kings held courts in different regions, negotiated directly with nobles, settled disputes, supervised officials, and reinforced loyalty through personal appearances. Eleanor traveled beside Henry through much of this world. And unlike many queens, she remained visibly involved in political life. She governed Aquitaine in Henry's absence, supervised regional affairs, participated in diplomacy, and maintained her own networks of influence among the southern French nobility. Her authority within Aquitaine remained especially important because many nobles there viewed her, rather than Henry, as the true source of legitimacy. In many respects, Eleanor helped hold the empire together culturally as well as politically. Aquitaine itself remained one of the most sophisticated aristocratic regions in Europe, and Eleanor carried its traditions wherever she went. The courts associated with her patronage became centers of literature, music, poetry, and refined noble culture. Troubadours continued performing within aristocratic households tied to her influence. Courtly etiquette evolved into an important marker of status and prestige. This cultural influence mattered politically. Medieval courts were not merely places of entertainment. They functioned as centers of diplomacy, alliance building, and aristocratic competition. Nobles sought favor through ceremony, patronage, and reputation as much as through military service. A ruler's court reflected the strength, sophistication, and legitimacy of the dynasty itself. And Eleanor's courts became legendary. Writers and poets later associated her household with the flourishing ideals of courtly love and chivalric refinement. Whether some later stories were exaggerated or romanticized, there is little doubt that Eleanor helped shape the aristocratic culture of 12th-century Europe profoundly. Under her influence, noble identity itself was evolving. The medieval knight increasingly became more than a mounted warrior. Chivalry expanded into a broader code involving honor, loyalty, refinement, religious devotion, and service to noble ideals. Literature celebrating romance, sacrifice, and courtly behavior spread through aristocratic society. Eleanor stood at the center of this transformation. Yet courtly splendor existed beside constant political tension. The Angevin Empire was vast but fragile. Its territories possessed different customs, rival noble families, competing loyalties, and regional ambitions. Holding such an enormous political structure together required relentless effort. Henry spent much of his reign suppressing rebellions, negotiating disputes, reforming administration, and strengthening royal authority against powerful nobles. And as royal administration expanded, medieval monarchy itself was changing. Henry introduced legal reforms strengthening the English crown and expanding royal courts. Written administration became increasingly important. Officials, clerks, and legal systems slowly transformed governance from purely feudal relationships into something more organized and centralized. Eleanor witnessed this transformation directly. She had grown up during an era when much of Europe remained politically fragmented and locally focused. Now she lived within a world where royal governments were becoming larger, more sophisticated, and increasingly interconnected across regions. At the same time, the royal household itself expanded rapidly. Eleanor and Henry produced many children, including future rulers such as Richard the Lionheart and John, King of England. Dynastic success initially strengthened the monarchy enormously. Multiple sons secured succession while daughters created valuable marriage alliances across Europe. But medieval dynasties carried dangers hidden beneath apparent strength. The more heirs a ruler possessed, the greater the possibility of future rivalry. And slowly, beneath the grandeur of the Angevin court, tensions within the royal family began growing darker. Henry's relentless ambition strained relationships around him. His repeated infidelities humiliated Eleanor publicly. Questions of inheritance created conflict among their sons. Noble factions gathered around rival princes hoping to shape the future of the empire through succession politics. The court that once symbolized strength and sophistication gradually became a battlefield of ambition, loyalty, and betrayal. And Eleanor, who had helped build one of the greatest dynastic empires in medieval Europe, would soon find herself drawn into conflict not against foreign enemies, but against her own husband. By the 1170s, the great Angevin Empire created through the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II of England had become one of the most powerful political structures in Europe. But beneath its strength, fractures were spreading through the royal family itself. The empire was simply too vast, too complicated, and too dependent upon the personalities controlling it. Territories stretched across England and France, each region carrying its own laws, customs, noble rivalries, and political ambitions. Holding the empire together required constant negotiation between kings, princes, bishops, and aristocrats whose loyalties shifted whenever weakness appeared. And increasingly, weakness was emerging inside the royal household. Henry II possessed extraordinary political ability, but he also struggled to share power. He granted titles and lands to his sons while refusing to surrender meaningful authority. The princes grew older surrounded by wealth, armies, and noble supporters, yet remained frustrated by their lack of independence. The tensions became personal as well as political. Henry's repeated infidelities humiliated Eleanor publicly over many years. Among his most famous mistresses was Rosamund Clifford, whose relationship with the king later became surrounded by legend and romantic myth. Whether exaggerated or not, the affairs deepened resentment within the royal marriage. At the same time, Eleanor's sons increasingly turned against their father. The medieval royal family was not simply a household. It was a political battlefield where inheritance determined the future of kingdoms. Rival noble factions gathered around different princes hoping to secure influence through succession. Every disagreement carried enormous consequences. Eleanor understood these dangers intimately. She had spent her life navigating dynastic politics, and she recognized that Henry's refusal to distribute meaningful authority threatened the stability of the entire empire. Her sons, particularly Henry the young king, Richard the Lionheart, and Geoffrey II, Duke of Brittany, became increasingly frustrated and ambitious. Eventually, resentment turned into rebellion. In 1173, the Angevin world exploded into crisis. Encouraged by rival nobles and foreign rulers eager to weaken Henry II, Eleanor's sons launched a massive revolt against their father. The rebellion spread across England and France as discontented nobles joined the conflict hoping to gain power or independence from royal authority. And Eleanor herself sided with her sons. This decision would define the most dangerous period of her life. The reasons behind her support remain debated by historians. Personal resentment toward Henry certainly played a role. So did concern for her son's political futures and the independence of Aquitaine itself. But beyond individual motives, the rebellion reflected deeper instability within the Angevin Empire. Questions of inheritance and authority threatened to tear apart the very political structure Eleanor and Henry had built together. Eleanor attempted to travel south disguised in male clothing to join her sons and allied forces. She never reached them. Henry's loyalists intercepted and captured her before she could escape. The consequences were devastating. While Henry eventually defeated the rebellion militarily, he viewed Eleanor's involvement as an unforgivable betrayal. Unlike rebellious sons who could potentially be reconciled through future succession, Eleanor represented something far more dangerous, a politically experienced queen whose legitimacy, inheritance, and influence still carried enormous authority across Europe. So Henry imprisoned her. For nearly 16 years, Eleanor lived under varying degrees of confinement. She was not thrown into a dungeon in chains as later legends sometimes imagined. Eleanor remained a queen, treated according to her rank and status. She moved between royal castles under guard, attended certain ceremonies when politically necessary, and lived with noble comforts unavailable to ordinary prisoners. But she was no longer free. The woman who had once traveled across kingdoms, governed territories, led courts, negotiated alliances, and moved through the centers of European power now lived under supervision and restriction. For Eleanor, the imprisonment must have felt especially cruel because movement had defined so much of her life. She had crossed mountains during crusade. Had ridden between courts from Aquitaine to Normandy to England. Had shaped politics through direct presence and personal influence. Now the world moved without her. And during those years, tragedy continued striking the Angevin family. Henry the young king died in 1183 after rebellion and illness. Geoffrey II, Duke of Brittany later died unexpectedly in 1186. Rivalries among the surviving sons intensified further as succession became increasingly uncertain. Yet one son steadily rose above the others. Richard. From childhood, Richard the Lionheart had inherited much of Eleanor's connection to Aquitaine. He grew up immersed in the aristocratic culture of southern France, learning poetry, warfare, diplomacy, and noble ceremony. Unlike his father's relentless administrative focus, Richard embodied many ideals associated with medieval chivalry and knightly kingship. He became a legendary warrior long before becoming king. Tall, charismatic, and militarily gifted, Richard gained admiration throughout Europe for courage and battlefield skill. Yet he also inherited the fierce ambition and political complexity that characterized the Angevin dynasty itself. Eleanor understood Richard perhaps better than anyone. Their relationship grew especially strong during the years of political conflict with Henry II. Richard increasingly became both Eleanor's political hope and the future of the Angevin realms. Meanwhile Henry II aged beneath the pressures of endless rebellion, war, and dynastic instability. His empire remained powerful, but maintaining control exhausted him physically and emotionally. One by one, many of those closest to him turned against him. Even Richard eventually rebelled alongside Philip II of France against his father. The conflict broke Henry completely. In 1189, abandoned by many allies and weakened by illness, Henry II died. And with his death, Eleanor's imprisonment ended instantly. After 16 years of confinement, she emerged once more into the political world, not as a defeated queen, but as the mother of the new King of England. Richard the Lionheart now ruled the Angevin Empire. And Eleanor, even in her 60s, immediately returned to power with astonishing energy. She traveled across England securing loyalty for Richard's succession. She negotiated alliances, organized administration, and stabilized territories vulnerable to unrest during the transition of power. Many younger nobles who expected age to diminish her influence quickly realized that Eleanor remained one of the most formidable political figures in Europe. In many ways, imprisonment had not broken her. It had merely delayed her return. And as Richard prepared for another great crusade to the Holy Land, Eleanor once again found herself standing at the center of medieval history. When Richard the Lionheart became king in 1189, much of Europe celebrated the rise of a ruler who seemed to embody the ideals of medieval chivalry itself. Richard was everything many nobles admired in a warrior king. He was courageous in battle, charismatic before armies, physically imposing, and fiercely determined. Songs and stories about his military skill spread rapidly through aristocratic courts. To many contemporaries, Richard appeared almost like a legendary knight stepped directly out of the romances and troubadour poems that had flourished during the cultural world shaped partly by Eleanor of Aquitaine herself. Yet Richard's reign also revealed the contradictions of medieval kingship. He spent remarkably little time in England. His attention focused primarily on warfare, crusading, and maintaining the vast Angevin territories across Europe. For Richard, kingship was inseparable from military glory and dynastic survival. And once again, Eleanor stood beside the center of events. After 16 years of imprisonment under Henry II of England, many might have expected Eleanor to retreat quietly from political life. Instead, she returned with astonishing energy despite being around 65 years old, an extraordinary age in the medieval world. Richard trusted her completely. As preparations began for the Third Crusade, Eleanor effectively helped stabilize the Angevin realms during one of the most dangerous transitions of power in Europe. She traveled across England and France securing loyalty to Richard's rule, supervising administration, negotiating alliances, and ensuring the succession unfolded without major collapse. Her political experience had become invaluable. Few people alive understood dynastic politics, noble rivalries, and aristocratic diplomacy better than Eleanor. She had witnessed nearly the entire transformation of 12th-century Europe firsthand: crusades, rebellions, royal marriages, succession crises, political fragmentation, and the growth of increasingly powerful monarchies. And even in old age, rulers still depended upon her. When Richard departed for crusade, Eleanor remained one of the central stabilizing figures of the empire. Medieval government could not simply function automatically in a king's absence. Royal authority depended upon trusted individuals capable of maintaining loyalty among nobles whose ambitions constantly threatened instability. Eleanor fulfilled that role brilliantly. But the medieval world rarely allowed long periods of peace. While fighting in the Holy Land, Richard gained legendary status through campaigns against Saladin during the struggle for Jerusalem. Stories of Richard's battlefield courage spread throughout Europe, strengthening his reputation as the ideal crusader king. Yet the crusade failed to fully reclaim Jerusalem. And Richard's return journey created disaster. In 1192, while traveling back through Europe, Richard was captured near Vienna by forces loyal to Leopold V, Duke of Austria. Eventually he was handed over to Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor, and held prisoner for enormous ransom. The situation threatened catastrophe. Without Richard, the Angevin Empire once again faced instability. Rival nobles maneuvered for advantage. John, King of England, Eleanor's youngest surviving son, began positioning himself politically during Richard's absence. Foreign rulers watched carefully for weakness. And once more, Eleanor stepped forward. Despite her age, she worked relentlessly to secure Richard's release. She organized negotiations, gathered support, traveled across dangerous routes, and helped raise the immense ransom demanded for the king's freedom. Chroniclers described the extraordinary burden placed upon England and the Angevin territories to pay the sum required. Yet Eleanor persisted. Even in her 70s, she continued moving through the political machinery of medieval Europe with remarkable determination. Richard eventually returned and restored control over his territories, but his reign remained dominated by warfare and conflict. In 1199, during a campaign in France, he suffered a wound from a crossbow bolt while besieging a small castle at Cailles-Chabrol Castle. The injury became infected. And soon, Richard the Lionheart was dead. For Eleanor, the loss must have felt devastating. Richard had been not only her son, but the political future she had fought to protect through rebellion, imprisonment, and decades of dynastic struggle. Now another generation of Angevin stability vanished into uncertainty. The throne passed to John, King of England. Unlike Richard, John lacked the same reputation for military charisma and knightly prestige. His reign would later become associated with political conflict, territorial losses, and growing tension with the English nobility. Yet even during this unstable transition, Eleanor continued working to preserve the dynasty. Remarkably, she remained politically active into extreme old age. She negotiated marriage alliances between kingdoms, helped secure loyalty for John's rule, and traveled repeatedly despite the physical hardships of medieval roads and winter journeys. Most people in the 12th century never reached such advanced age. Eleanor not only survived into her 80s, but continued influencing European politics while many of her contemporaries had long since disappeared into history. Gradually, however, age and exhaustion finally overtook her. The medieval world Eleanor had known throughout her life was also beginning to change. New generations of rulers emerged. Political rivalries intensified between England and France. Royal governments became more organized and centralized. The crusading ideal that had once dominated Europe slowly lost some of its earlier unity and confidence. And Eleanor herself became something larger than a queen. She became a living connection to an earlier age. By the time she withdrew increasingly to Fontevraud Abbey, she had witnessed nearly every defining transformation of 12th century Europe. She had traveled farther, ruled longer, and influenced more kingdoms than almost any woman of the medieval era. When Eleanor died in 1204, around the age of 80 or perhaps slightly older, her life already seemed almost legendary. She had been Duchess of Aquitaine, Queen of France, Queen of England, Mother of Kings, participant in crusades, prisoner of a king, architect of dynastic alliances, patron of aristocratic culture, and one of the central political figures of medieval Europe. Her legacy endured far beyond her death. The political consequences of her marriages shaped centuries of Anglo-French rivalry. The cultural traditions tied to her courts influenced medieval literature, courtly romance, and chivalric ideals across Europe. The model of queenship she embodied expanded expectations surrounding female political authority within aristocratic society. Even later generations struggled to fully define her. Some chroniclers condemned her ambition and independence. Others admired her intelligence, resilience, and political skill. Legends grew around her life because Eleanor seemed to exist somewhere between history and myth, too large, too influential, and too unusual to fit comfortably within medieval expectations of womanhood. But perhaps her greatest significance lies in the transformation she represented. Through Eleanor's life, medieval Europe itself changed. Feudal territories evolved into more interconnected political systems. Courts became centers of diplomacy, culture, and administration. Aristocratic identity grew more refined and ceremonial. Queens gained more visible political roles. Dynastic politics expanded across kingdoms with increasing complexity. Eleanor did not create all these changes alone. But for nearly an entire century, she stood close to the center of them. And long after the candlelit halls of Aquitaine faded into silence, long after Crusader kingdoms collapsed, and long after the Angevin Empire itself fractured beneath war and ambition, the shadow of Eleanor of Aquitaine still remained across medieval history.